Get out the insurance cards, get out the copays. The office is open, my friends. Brought to you by drroto.com.
What is up, and welcome into the Pros with Joe's podcast. For those of y'all who have joined us for episodes past, you will notice that it is I, Eric, at Fantasy Nav, who is leading us into this podcast, and not our friend John Dansby. Our friend John has gone out today and gotten the big poke, the Fauci ouchie, and he is feeling a little bit under the weather. So y'all are stuck with me. One thing that you can do to help our guy feel better, find him there on the Twitter machine at Dansby's Fantasy. Give him a follow. Laugh at some of the jokes that he makes, even if they're not funny. It will, in fact, make him feel better and help him recover in time for next week's episode. But while we are here, just us here, we can take a look at the Pros with Joe's Charity League. Again, we are in year 2 of the Charity League, and now here in week 15, we are in the playoffs. We have cut our field down from 42 all the way down to 8. So here on this week's episode of the podcast, we're going to run through not only everything that's happening in the NFL itself, but also in the happenings of the league. And we will actually start right there. Like I mentioned, we narrow our field dramatically. We go down to 8 out of a field of 42. And heading into week 14, there were a few spots that were still up for grabs. The way that playoff seeding is determined, each of our 6 divisions has a leader of that division that will get a playoff bye, and the remaining 2 spots are designated by the highest points scored of the teams that did not get in on divisional record. So that leaves us with 6 division winners, 2 wild cards, and 8 total teams heading into our postseason. And on the whole, most teams had already determined their fate heading into week 14, but there were a couple of spots of note. Most notably was actually our guest last week, Mr. Jeff Bell. He was in the classic win and in situation, and ultimately no style points here, but we did see Team Bell reign triumphant over Team Calandro. He had about an 8-point margin of victory as he won in week 14 by a score of 115 to 107. So Mr. Bell punches his ticket, and that is material because the first wildcard team is actually the highest scoring team in the league who shares a division with Jeff Bell, and that is our guy, G-Men Jay Felicio. He currently leads the entire league with 2,028 points scored, but did not have the record to win his division. So that has him now as the first at-large bid and leaving a very narrow pool of teams behind him that can ultimately contend for that second and final wild card spot. Taking a look at those teams, there were really 2 in particular that were close enough. Actually, most of the high scorers ended up winning their division outright. So of the field at large, we actually had 2 teams, Jen Piacenti and our own Dr. Roto, that were duking it out for that last spot, and it came down to the wire. Jen Piacenti actually fell in her matchup to Scott Engel, again, because records were not potentially up for grabs for this division. That did not change her standing, but her score of 112.5 points did, as Dr. Roto finished his day victorious and tallying 135 points, leaving him with a margin of about 23 points to get into that final spot as the last at-large team and finalizing our group of 8. So recapping that group, we now have a short list of 8 teams that are still alive in the postseason. And as a reminder out there, the way that we determine our winner is a traditional playoff bracket, and the winner of that bracket is going to take home the amount of funds that we have raised throughout the duration of the season. So all 8 of these teams have a corresponding charity that they are playing along for. The first seed is actually going to our highest score, Mr. Jay Felicio, he's playing for Child's Play Charity. If you want to hear a little bit about what they do there and about why it's meaningful to him, go all the way back to week 2 of the Pros with Joe's podcast. You'll actually hear it from the man himself, how Child's Play Charity not only impacted his life, but continue to impact the lives of those that are spending an unfortunate amount of time in hospital care and trying to make their days a little bit brighter. Looking at our number 2 overall seed, we have Mr. Troy King, T King Mode. He is playing for the March of Dimes. Our 3 seed, Matt Harmon, is playing for a cause near and dear to his heart, the Therese Paylor Endowment for Howard University. Those of you that are not familiar, Therese was a colleague of Matt's at Yahoo and unfortunately passed before his time, but now his colleagues, his friends, his loved ones are working to do some good for Team All Juice and making sure that there is an endowment in his name at Howard University, his alma mater. So certainly check that out. 4 seed himself is Dr. Roto. He's playing for the PKD Foundation. Anyone who hasn't heard this story, it is absolutely awe-inspiring. Doc himself was in need of a kidney due to PKD, to kidney disease, and reached out to his listeners, subscribers, and fans, and actually found a living kidney donor by way of fantasy football. Maybe one of the coolest things that fantasy football has ever done. Connected our very own Doc Roto to a donor that quite literally saved his life. And obviously now he owes a debt of gratitude to that fan, but also to the PKD Foundation, the work that they do to fight off kidney disease. Taking a look at the 5 seed, we have Scott Engel. He's playing for Big League Impact. Really cool organization doing a lot of different things to help the broader community by way of their influence through baseball, bringing a lot of different players and different Hall of Famers to participate in a number of causes. Our 6th seed is none other than our guest last week, Jeff Bell. We talked a bit about Nationwide Children's Hospital and the work that they are doing there in the Ohio area. Only need to go back a week to hear Jeff himself talk about that work and why it is meaningful to him. Our 7th seed is Dan Klaskins, who is playing for DAV, Disabled American Veterans. That is a cause that is very near and dear to his heart and one that he dedicates a lot of time to, both on and off the fantasy airwaves. So check out DAV.org for the work they're doing. And finally, Michael Florio playing for American Cancer Society. Obviously, cancer is absolutely horrific and feels like it has touched just about everybody's life. And the American Cancer Society is working to mitigate the likelihood of getting cancer and to increase the survival rates of those who are unfortunately diagnosed. So that is our group of 8. Again, a quick recap of the different causes that they're playing for. And as we proceed through each week of the postseason, we will narrow down the field by half until we eventually end up with our champion, who will not only take home the glory of knowing that they have survived this field of 42, but they will also secure the funds that we have raised for their charity of choice. Taking a look at week 15, and specifically the lead-in to week 15, in the NFL, the biggest news by far is the rampant COVID outbreak that the NFL is facing. Over the last few days, we have nearly 100 positives across a number of different organizations. Actually, 8 of those organizations are in enhanced COVID protocols. And very much so, we have not only player availability in question, but just in general, whether or not games will be able to be played at their scheduled times or in their scheduled week here as we round out the NFL regular season. And the implications for that are great in terms of the fantasy world. It feels every day a different player is potentially getting picked off of a roster due to either close contact or to a positive test themselves. And what I was curious to see is how this played out on the waiver wire. And specifically for the pizza division, rather as a reminder, hope this isn't particularly inflammatory, only teams that remain in the playoffs are allowed to make waiver moves. Know that this is the Twitter topic du jour, but ultimately we want to make sure that only the players that are still alive and vying for position are able to make those transactions, and that is a hill that I am willing to die on. So with that, in the pizza division, we have two available candidates, Team Florio and Team Harmon. Mike Florio actually decided to stand pat and was comfortable with his team as currently constructed, whereas Team Harmon went all in. Heading into the week, he had 630 of his 1,000 fab dollars left over in his coffer, and he spent 601 on them to acquire the services of Rashad Penny. Obviously, we saw Penny absolutely explode against the Texans in week 14, and generally speaking, as long as he's healthy, which unfortunately for him is quite the if, certainly looks to be the most capable and the most explosive of running backs there in Seattle. So certainly can see why Matt Harmon would covet that type of player making his way onto his roster. Forwarding over to the Wings division, we have crickets. We have two teams here. We have Team Jeff Bell and Team Jay Felicio, neither of which felt like they needed to make any particular moves. I will say that this has been one of the more active divisions or conferences when it comes to waiver activity. So the free agent pool is relatively picked over. But I wouldn't be surprised when we run again here on Friday or heading into next week if we see the remaining teams continue to make some moves, or rather start to make some moves here in this conference. But the conference that I want to talk about is the Nachos Conference. We saw a flurry of activity. Team Doc, Team Engel are the two remaining candidates here, still available to make waiver moves in this particular conference. And we saw them make 5 transactions across the two of them. Scott Engel went out and acquired Gerald Everett, potentially as a Seahawk homer. We'll have to have him on and find out for ourselves. Kenneth Gainwell, he added for $27, and Malcolm Brown, he added for $57. So ultimately, not necessarily the biggest names out there of the lot. Malcolm Brown could potentially stand to have an impact this week, as seemingly everybody in the Miami running back room has been placed in the COVID protocol or on COVID reserve. And so he could be the only available option there in Miami, and therefore the best of a bad situation. Kenneth Gainwell, I think, is somewhat of an interesting pick. It's really hard to get a read on what Nick Sirianni and this Eagles coaching staff is going to do with their running backs. One thing, or the only thing that seems to be constant there, is they do not like Miles Sanders for some unforeseen reason. And so acquiring shares of a running back that is not named Miles Sanders could pay out down the stretch run. So certainly some interesting trades there. As we scroll down to Dr. Roto and what he was able to do, certainly a bit more miserly in how he decided to spend his fab dollars. Spent $6 each on 2 players, acquired Justin Fields for an even 6, and he acquired D. Ernest Johnson for $6. Right now, we see really the culmination of 2 different things happening there in Cleveland. They are one of the 8 teams that has entered into enhanced protocols and seem to be in the midst of an outright outbreak. We saw Jarvis Landry, we saw Baker Mayfield, several other players. I think it was about a half a dozen players in total ultimately end up on the COVID reserve for Cleveland. And moreover, to the running back rooms, we saw Kareem Hunt exit last week's game with injury and is now being considered week to week. So for me, of these 5 players, I actually think the D'Ernest Johnson one is probably the sharpest add of the lot. Not only considering the amount that he went for to acquire him for $6, but we've seen D'Ernest Johnson have a role in this offense, even when Nick Chubb is available, as is going to be the circumstance for at least one more week. But B, we have no idea where this is going to ultimately unfold in terms of this COVID outbreak in Cleveland. So there's a likelihood that not only could D'Ernest Johnson have a role in this offense, but he could be the lead back, as we saw not that long ago on Thursday night against Denver, where he absolutely exploded and finished the week as a running back one that Doc now has on his team for a mere $6. So, taking a look at not only this time of year, but specifically the circumstances that are arising with COVID in the NFL, I think it's very much so going to be a war of attrition, and having as many able and available bodies on your bench as possible is going to be a key strategy for anyone that is wanting to make a long run. And with that, we will welcome in our esteemed guest for tonight's episode, Mr. Jeff Erickson of RotoWire. Jeff, how's it going? Thanks for taking a little time for us tonight.
Doing well, Eric. How you doing, man?
Doing well. We're finally here into the fantasy playoffs. We obviously kicked off the playoffs for the charity league as well. I'm actually trying to think if there's any format where it potentially hasn't started yet. I don't think those are out there. But yeah, it's certainly an exciting time of year, and definitely pumped to have you come and spend a little time with us as we wrap things up with the charity league.
Yeah, and fell a little short of the playoffs, unfortunately, but it's all right. We had a good run. Jim and I had a good run, and it was whack-a-mole this year. One thing would pop up, an injury or an illness would pop up. We'd address that and have to do the next one there, and just kept on going through that constantly, it seemed like, and just fell a little short because of that.
Yeah, and the format itself is a bit tricky to navigate that, just given that you're essentially in a 14-team league with relatively deep benches and obviously a ton of industry experts. So definitely a pretty sharp league. But I guess we'll talk a little bit more about your team and its fortunes as we carry on here. To kick us off, I would actually love if you can tell the audience a bit about the cause that you're supporting and why that group is important to you.
Yeah, it's a cerebral aneurysm foundation, and it's because my mom, when I was a kid, suffered a ruptured cerebral aneurysm when I was 7 years old. That's for those that are unfamiliar with it, it's not totally common, So, but it was a blood vessel in the brain swelled up and ruptured, and usually it's a 50% mortality rate from that. And she survived that, and there was a lot of serendipity there. We were supposed to be on a ski trip up in northern Michigan. Instead, we got snowed in, and I lived in Indianapolis, Indiana at the time. We got snowed in for the weekend. A big blizzard hit. But they plowed our streets maybe an hour and a half before it happened. Indianapolis has a Methodist Hospital, one of the best neurosurgery units in the country, in part because of the Indy 500 and all that. That they always had a great neurosurgery unit there. So we had great doctors that took care of her right away, and she was able to recover from that. She spent maybe 3 months in the hospital, had multiple surgeries, had to learn how to walk again, had to learn how to talk again, did a lot of things, and she's still alive to this day, and she's just quite a fighter, but she had a lot of help along the way. And I hope other people can have that help in the future if they go through something like that. Pretty traumatic thing in our life, but you wouldn't be able to tell just by talking with her that the long-lasting ramifications of it. But no, so it's something that means a lot to me.
Yeah, certainly, and obviously, I've heard you share this story before, and the very first time that I heard it, I thought that this was going to be a cause that you were taking up in memoriam. I was a bit surprised to hear that that she made it through. She was part of that 50%, and the work that they're doing over there at the Brain Aneurysm Foundation is very much so helping to expand those odds, so that if it happens to you or someone that you love, their likelihood of being able to not only survive but live a long and fruitful life, as Jeff's mom has, are greatly increased. So very much so an awesome cause, and definitely love hearing you share your story. For the people that either were unaware or that were not tracking the league or following the league last year, Jeff, you are one of our original pros, and you are in your second year here in Pros with Joe. So I'm curious to know whether it's this year or last, do you have any kind of funny stories from working alongside your co-manager, or any memories that stick out about your experience in the league so far?
Well, it's fun. This year we were playing, all flex. So I like that, actually. It was fun to do that. And it was interesting to see how running backs did get pushed down in this draft. a little bit there. Like notably Miles Sanders, except I still was the sucker that took him anyhow later on in the draft. But it's it was a little bit different. One thing is my Jim, my co-manager, he keeps weird hours. He keeps late hours. He's an internist. So like I never know when he's up, and never know when he's asleep. But I know that I can text him at like 11 o'clock Pacific, and hey, he might be up and working still, and all that. So it kind of worked out pretty well there. But a lot of things about this league were fun, and it's just staying on top of things. And like I said before, it was whack-a-mole. Like we had Kamara, of course he misses a bunch of games. We had McLaurin's now out this week, and he's been banged up other times. We lost Thielen just at the wrong time. We lost Sanders just at the wrong time. It's kind of all throughout there. It's amazing we even made it to 500 with everything that went wrong. But we just kept scrambling. It was fun.
Yeah, and tracking along with your team from my side, it seemed like it was just a calamity of errors and no unforced errors. Just seemingly every time you were about to get someone back, someone else got hit with the whammy and ended up injuring themselves or on the COVID list. So certainly these things have a tendency and a way of happening. One thing I want to maybe double back to is something you mentioned a moment ago. A thing that we changed heading into year 2 is we took this all flex approach. So apart from quarterback and defense, the entire roster for Pros with Joe's 2 is all flex spots. So wanted to know from you, Jeff, is this your first time playing with that sort of wrinkle, and how did that maybe inform your strategy overall?
It's the first all flex. I've played with like multi flex before, but first all flex, and I liked it. I like it. I think it opens up the door to some strategies. And you try to see what you're going to focus on, what are you going to try to promote, what are you going to emphasize? That I play in Scott Fishbowl, and he obviously does things a little bit differently than most, and he has like weighted scoring in favor of tight ends. He has multiple flexes, so it's similar. But here, just if you don't want to have running backs, okay, fine, just excuse me. I just go crazy, folks. And so you saw that in some of the draft strategies there. You saw some teams not take a running back until like round 5 or 6. And hey, viva la difference. It was pretty cool to see.
Yeah, actually, draft a running back all the way through. So definitely gave managers a bit more agency over how they wanted to construct their roster. And it was fun to watch play out, right? I had a front row seat to all 3 of our drafts and see exactly what everyone will do when they aren't, restricted by the confines of a roster.
Yeah, I'd like to play that format again for sure.
Yeah, I think we're planning on carrying it forward. So
good.
I'll just assumptively lump you into the yeses for Pros with Joe's 3, and you'll have your shot in 2022.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
So I guess maybe zooming out a little bit to kind of the broader state of the league. COVID is obviously running rampant through the NFL. I think it's about 100 positives over the last handful of days. 8 teams are currently in enhanced safety protocols. And obviously, first and foremost, we hope that everyone is able to get through it without, severe illness or any sort of downstream ramifications. But putting that real world stuff aside, certainly couldn't come at a worse time in terms of the fantasy implications. So, maybe could you walk everyone through how you navigate this very bumpy reality heading into the fantasy playoffs?
I'm still trying to figure it out, Eric. That's the thing. I mean, it's so many news items popping up. I think it's going to be one of those where every day it's almost like running a fantasy baseball team. And, usually we have a little rhythm to our week. You do your waivers one day, then you stew on your lineups. Here, you're like reacting to the news constantly, left and right. And just because it happens to be, usually like there's a rhythm on the injury news that leaks out. Sometimes you get something surprising that happens on a Friday, but usually by Friday, we know what's going to happen for the week. This week, I wouldn't be surprised if we hear big news on Saturday, big news on Sunday morning. The way this is going around right now, with the infection rate so high, you got to think that there's going to be every day we're going to get someone significant. Baker Mayfield today, for instance. Who is it going to be tomorrow? It's going to be some other starting quarterback. I would make sure that if you're going into your fantasy playoffs, you want to have like backups at every position. Fortunately, you'll have fewer people to compete with on the waiver wire. That helps, but also inventory might be a little low too.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, to a certain extent, this was somewhat predicted, right? There was a lot of conversation and dialogue around the impetus on depth in this year and last year more than any. And now I went into the year hoping to avoid as many consolidation trades as I typically do. And now the leagues where I'm actually best suited are the ones where I actually didn't have those trades go through, not by any strategy or wisdom. It's just merely the ones where those trades didn't get accepted, and now I have a few more bench pieces. So definitely feels like depth is the key. Definitely like the tie into the fantasy baseball plug, where you're literally working the wire and churning your roster